It's been a whirlwind of activity since California signed House Bill 206 into law, with more than a dozen similar bills in the states across America in some stage of development. Ash, you and I, we had to get together earlier in the week than the normal show to kind of talk about this and just what this means for college football. In the beginning, it kind of looked like California was a one-off, but now that we're seeing so many of these bills kind of coming up in states across the country, realizing that maybe this could be some irreversible momentum in the way college football is going to be handled from here out.
Yeah, it's really cool to see it happening, but also a little bit unsettling for us old guard college football fans. I think the big debate right now is, will NCAA sports at this level turn into a minor league for the professional leagues? And really everything is a big question right now. So
Yeah, I think
glad to have guests that can help us.
Yeah, we've got a ton of questions. And so with us today is Darren Heitner. Darren's a Miami area lawyer who's helping to craft the legislation for the state of Florida. Darren, thanks so much for joining us on From the Stands.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So now our conversation is going to be more Florida focused, but I think this is kind of indicative of what's happening across the country right now with different states jumping on board. And I have to get this out of the way. On From the Stands, we embrace our bias. So tell me about kind of your college football allegiances, fandom, your background in that area.
I don't hide it. I'm very transparent. I went to the University of Florida for 7 years for undergrad and for my law school education. I even taught there afterwards. I'm going up there this Saturday for the Auburn game and hopefully see the Gators just slaughter them. So I'm a diehard Gator, orange and blue all the way.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's going to be very reassuring is knowing that there is a diehard college football fan behind some of this, and it's not, a business interest. So it's people that actually care about the game. And so tell me, what has this week been like for you as we've seen so much activity on this topic?
I do want to actually respond to your statement. I do not want to see college football or college sports be eradicated. I'm simply looking at what the student athletes should be afforded in terms of their rights. And so this past week has been interesting in the sense that it's a discussion that I've had for a long time and my colleagues have had for a long time, which is simply that college athletes should have the same rights as every other American, in that they're able to exploit their name, image, and likeness, which are considered publicity rights.
Yes.
But this week has been a whirlwind of attention toward this. Obviously, California taking the lead, passing legislation to that effect, and then having it signed into law by the governor alongside LeBron James, which always helps with regard to generating some publicity. And so what's interesting is that prior to this week, I was already speaking very closely with Representative LaMarca in the state of Florida, a Republican, who has been interested in crafting legislation to this effect. And so the timing can't be better for us because there's so much attention being paid to not only California, but New York, that's also proposed legislation, South Carolina, and even now Minnesota after we have in Florida. So I think it's appropriate. I hope that people aren't doing it simply for publicity, that at the heart of this matter, there's a true interest in giving student athletes these important rights. And again, the intention is not to eradicate college sports as we know it, nor to create a minor league system. To be clear, we're not trying to change any NCAA rules or regulations, but for give these athletes these specific set of rights. If there are improper benefits provided to athletes outside of that, the NCAA rules and regulations will still apply. And at least as far as the Florida government's concerned, they're not looking to get involved in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did see earlier this week Florida House Bill 251, which very similar to yours will allow athletes in Florida to, among other things, be compensated for their name, image, and likeness, the NIL. So how kind of does your bill, the one that you're working with, kind of differentiate, or how will this kind of augment or support that?
To be clear, I'm a lawyer and not a politician. My understanding is that there's sort of a little bit of a political struggle going on in the state of Florida where, again, you have LaMarca, who I've teamed up with, proposing our legislation by the end of this week. And my understanding, another Democrat politician who saw what happened in California and rushed to release his own bill. And again, my understanding is that the Democrats' bill is almost, if not, a mirror image of the California bill. What we've tried to do is take our time, look at the California bill, take out the parts that we think are proper and prudent in the state of Florida, but also look at every word, change the language so that it's proper, and also so that it meets what we're trying to accomplish in Florida. For instance, our legislation looks at how we want, just like California, we want to allow the student athletes to have certain types of representation when they're negotiating these types of deals.
Sure.
So we cite to the specific Florida statute, the Athlete Agent Act, and say that in order for an agent to work with a player, that person must be licensed and in good standing within the state of Florida. Or an athlete can have a lawyer, but that lawyer also must be licensed to practice law in the state of Florida and be in good standing.
Sure.
We're also very cognizant of the fact that in the state of Florida, there's an existing right of publicity statute, 540.08. And so we want to make sure that we address all the issues and have a bill that is not ambiguous to the best extent possible.
Sure. So one of the really cool things about our show is that we went on Reddit this morning and solicited a number of questions. And so these are things that are important. And I understand that you really can only speak to Florida, but you know, I think in general terms, there's a lot of questions that people have. So this one specifically was, how did you end up on this piece of legislature, and was it in consideration part of the California bill? I think you kind of talked to that, but if you want to just talk about how you came to be a part of this.
Sure. I actually did not have a relationship with Representative Chip LaMarca prior to this, even though he does represent my district in the state of Florida. But I had a relationship and have a relationship with one of his aides. And his aide was interested in working with Chip in proposing this type of legislation, and conducted his own research and reached out to me and said, we'd love you to be involved with this based on your legal practice, based on how much work you do in the sports space, and also based on my, my past in writing for Forbes and Inc. and working with a lot of sports agents, etc. So they decided to team up. I mean, I haven't received $1 from it thus far, and again, I'm not doing it for the publicity. I'm an athlete advocate. I've always fashioned myself as being an athlete advocate. I work with so many professional athletes. I've worked with some college athletes in disputes. And look, I honestly think it's a right that they deserve. And so I think Chip LaMarca and his team know that they're going to have a strong advocate on their side. And so they reached out to me, and I was happy to help.
Awesome.
Good deal.
So the next question we got is kind of talks about states versus federal, and kind of what'll have to happen in order for the NCAA to tip. It says, if enough states draft their own version of laws and pass them, do you see a similar thing happening on a federal level? And then would that law supersede the state's laws?
I hope so. I think in a perfect world, there'd actually be federal legislation that's proposed and then passed and put into law. Actually, in a perfect world, none of this would even have to occur. The states wouldn't have to pass their own legislation, and it wouldn't even take a federal effort. The NCAA would simply understand that it's a right that the players deserve, and that there is an interest state by state, if not on a federal level, for this to be changed, and make their own changes to the rules and regulations. And that would really ameliorate all of these efforts altogether. There would be no need for state by state to enact this type of legislation. But I do think if you find California, Florida, and then a big state being Texas, which we haven't heard about to date, but if those three big states pass legislation, and if, let's say, Texas decided to go the route that we're trying to do in Florida, which is enacting it immediately, not waiting until 2023, you may see more interest on the federal level and perhaps a bill proposed and potentially passed.
So I'm recording here in Austin, so absolutely all of our From the Stands fans, if when something does happen in Texas, being right here next to the state capitol, we'll be sure to follow up with that and try to get one of those legislators on the show to talk more about what's happening in Texas. So let's look at California, which is signed into law, Florida, which you guys are working toward, and the potential of Texas. Do you think those three states could be a tipping point of sorts for federal legislation?
I do, and I think California on its own is really creating quite a stir currently, to the extent that you already have some representatives on Capitol Hill discussing it currently. Now, everything's moving very quickly, and typically politicians do not move so quickly, and you don't find legislation proposed and then passed until a little bit of a grace period. But I do think with California passing the legislation, enacting it based on the governor's signature, and now Florida very serious about it. Again, I haven't heard anything about Texas, but if you have those three states pass legislation and sign it into law, I do think, at that point in time, it would be wrong for the federal government to not pay attention to it.
Absolutely. So do you think, and maybe you can explain to us maybe some of the language you're working into the legislation, that there will be or should be any sort of cap or fair market price in terms of the compensation someone could receive for their NILs?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
And one thing, we want to be very careful about the language that we use. It's
Mm,
not compensation. In
yeah.
fact, what the athletes will be able to generate are, in essence, royalties for the license of their publicity rights, so name, image, and likeness from third parties, corporations, and the like. But our idea is simply this: it's a free market. It's
Okay.
capitalism. Let the market dictate what the individual's value is. Let the
Yeah.
individual negotiate to his or her ability. And sometimes it'll be based on how great the individual performs on the field or on the court, etc. Other
Mm,
times it may be based on the social media following of the individual. I mean, these things play
sure.
out in real life outside of college sports. We deal with it in
Sure.
professional sports, and we deal with it outside of the sports industry. So, with able representatives, I think the individuals will be able to calculate what their value is and negotiate what the market allows them to in these types of deals.
Yeah, so
Mm.
I guess bear with me down this rabbit hole. And purely hypothetical, I just want to get kind of your response to a situation. Let's say I am Florida State alumni and I own a car dealership, and Ash is Miami alumni and he owns a car dealership, and you're Florida alumni and you own a car dealership, and all three of us make our pitch to the recruit. I'm going to offer 10,000, Ash is going to offer 20,000, you're going to offer 50,000 for him to, and say, if you sign with Florida and represent my dealership, I will give you 50,000. You don't see any kind of issue or any kind of how potential for this to become kind of problematic down the future?
One, that's an improper inducement under the NCAA rules and regulations. And if it
Okay.
comes out that there was that inducement that was provided, the school and the athlete will still suffer the same penalties that they would
Wow.
under the current rules and regulations that the NCAA provides. But second of all, and importantly, right now we're only talking about college students. So it sounds like you're talking about a recruitment tool
Okay.
where an athlete would choose a school based on the offer, the endorsement offer from an individual who may be loosely attached to that
Sure.
institution.
Right.
That wouldn't apply here because it still would be improper.
Okay.
It's prior to the individual enrolling in the
And
academic.
that impropriety would also include transfer students. So as someone goes into the transfer portal, we're still talking about the same improper inducement there.
Absolutely.
I think that's a very important distinction, Ash. Maybe something that a lot of people haven't realized or haven't considered when they make that argument. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like um, the issue for me is athlete agrees to represent or sell product for the largest Chevrolet dealership in town. Aside from the issues of, okay, he's coming right out of high school and he's being pushed and he's being swayed a little bit by Tulsa Chevrolet of Tulsa, Oklahoma, whereas Hollywood Chevrolet of California is going to be offering more. He might have originally leaned toward his hometown school, Tulsa, but all the extra money that's coming from Hollywood Chevrolet to come to UCLA is a pretty big enticement. But back to the original issue, which that's kind of off the rails. I think there hasn't been given enough consideration for product liability. When celebrities such as I used Caitlyn Jenner recently, she has an Instagram page. Most people know that, and there was a sway about what kind of liability that she has as a promoter for that product and everything. Are we talking about the same realm of liability here for Chevrolet or the University of Texas, for instance?
Let me first address the Tulsa versus California hypothetical that you provided. In my estimation, that's no different than the current landscape, which is you are still recruiting players based on perhaps what the program provides, the head coach, the facilities
Mm,
of the institution, the record of the institution, and its
sure.
history. So there's absolutely not a level playing field in college sports. For anyone
Yeah.
to say that it is currently level, I think they're lying to themselves. So there may be an instance where an individual assumes that
Mm,
there will be more opportunity, let's say off the field, at a California school than at a school in Tulsa. Well,
Sure.
the same's true for that athlete who may assume that he will have better potential to go pro by going to a school in California as opposed to going to the school in Tulsa.
And on the flip side, you could make an argument that a degree from Stanford is worth more than a degree from Middle Tennessee State University. Nothing against the Blue Raiders, but I mean, somebody who is really focused on their academic and post-playing career, there's definite intrinsic value that different degrees hold.
But touching on the other point, which is this question with regard to product liability, I mean, it's true. We live in a very litigious society. People will sue for pretty much anything. And what we're trying to do with our legislation in Florida is to, as best as we can, limit the exposure for the schools and for the student athletes. Is it going to be a situation where we can completely limit that eradicate that exposure? Absolutely not. People will sue when they want to sue because they see somebody perhaps with deep pockets, or they think they can coerce somebody into a submission by way of settlement. But there's a distinction between whether or not there's solid grounds as to that product liability lawsuit and whether we can eradicate those types of suits altogether. And to the question of whether we can, that's not the government's job.
Sure.
I think that's really courts providing their opinions on those particular matters, and hopefully those opinions serve as a deterrent to what's probably frivolous litigation.
Yeah. So one thing that is
my
the
fault for saying
job,
Caitlin. I meant Kylie. My fault.
I
don't follow Caitlin Jenner on Instagram. As most folks know, I don't even have an Instagram account. But you knew who I was talking about, I think. I'm not sure.
So one thing that is the government's job is taxing, tax laws, tax codes. How might this impact the NCAA's tax status? Is that something? Are they going to be able to use the amateurism to claim exemptions as they had in the past?
I don't think it affects their status whatsoever. The money simply won't be flowing through the institutions. And I don't think it's a Title IX issue either. This is simply allowing the individuals who are at the university to stroke their own deals separate and apart from the universities with third parties. So I don't think the NCAA or the member schools have anything to be concerned about with regard to this at all amending their tax status.
Yeah, one of the arguments we've seen from the NCAA has been in regards to the Commerce Clause. I'm not a lawyer. Can you kind of talk to me about what that argument is and how maybe your legislation addresses it?
Essentially, what the NCAA is saying is that if a few states pass this legislation, then they will have an unfair competitive advantage over other states. So you're creating a situation where there's no equilibrium, and you're providing certain states benefits over other states. I think that argument fails on its face. One, as I stated earlier, there's not a balance between states currently as far as the power of specific schools and conferences are concerned. But more importantly, we're talking about basic rights here. I think the NCAA is trying its best to come up with an argument where really there is none. The bottom line is every American, other than college athletes, have the ability to exploit their name, image, likeness for commercial gain. And so you either have states that have that common law right on the books, or you have states like Florida that have a statute concerning rights of publicity. Sure. And here's the NCAA that's trying to say, well, we don't care about your laws. This is our rule. So I think the states have a much stronger argument than the NCAA will. And it'll be interesting to see what the NCAA does if it's not just California that passes and enacts a law. What happens when there's a dozen or so states? Are they really going to attack each and every one of those states in their jurisdictions and potentially go through the appellate process? I mean, this could take years.
Yeah, that was a question, Darren, I wanted to ask. Will, I'll be real quick here. If this thing were to go higher and higher, I heard it pontificated on local radio here in Birmingham, Alabama yesterday, that this could be a Supreme Court issue. It's going to be between the NCAA and the individual states, I guess. What do you see the grounds for the Supreme Court to even consider this case? Because they consider so few.
I mean, it's a sexy talking point at this time, right? Everyone's talking about what if it gets to the Supreme Court. First of all, again, that's years down the line.
Right.
But the only likely scenario where this becomes a Supreme Court issue is, let's say, the NCAA sues in California and then sues in Florida. And let's say the NCAA prevails in California and loses in Florida. So you have differing opinions throughout the country. That's typically when the Supreme Court would step in because it wants to have uniformity across the land. But again, they're so far away from that.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical, surely.
Yeah. So in California, we saw the Pac-12 and the individual schools so outspoken. I think every school released a statement against the ruling. Is there any merit to their concern that you could see in Florida?
Well, I don't know that every school is going to be in favor of what we're trying to do in Florida. I certainly don't think that any school will be very vocal in supporting our efforts. I'm not sure exactly what the concern is. I think there may be a concern school to school as to whether or not there may be some competitive advantage, let's say, given to University of Florida over University of Miami.
Sure.
Again, I'm not within those circles specifically, so I don't know whether it's a true concern or whether there's some lobbying interests or otherwise. But, again, there's little to no risk for the universities. So I don't love the name of the California bill, the Pay for Play Act,
right?
Because it implies almost that the schools are paying the players, but they're not. And we're trying to be very clear. We're calling ours the Student Athlete Achievement Act, and we're trying to not confuse people into thinking that we're in any way involving ourselves, at least at the current time, with regard to schools potentially paying athletes for their performance.
Yeah. Sure. And I think even with the best intentions, people are still going to look for loopholes in the legislation. Have you identified any threats or weaknesses with your plans or things that concern you?
No, well, I mean, again, we're going through the process right now with regard to drafting, and we're making changes here and there. One thing that we've recently considered is what happens when there's a freshman who's under the age of majority. And so we're citing to specific provisions within Florida statutes that talk about verifying those contracts between minors and third parties. And it goes beyond just having guardian consent. It goes through probate courts in Florida. So again, I'm getting into the legal nuances, but I mean, we're trying our best to really make it as tight as possible, but also not go too far to open holes. It's a very delicate dance that you have to play in politics.
No doubt.
Do you think that this kind of panders to a small minority of athletes? I mean, it's not going to apply broad swaths. The walk-on long snapper is not going to, benefit from this as, say, the five-star recruit. But do you kind of see this as a way to kind of pander to some of those top athletes?
I don't believe so. I think that the top athletes will absolutely earn the majority of the opportunity that's out there. But I do think that you'll have a lot of individuals who may be on the swimming team or on the baseball team or on the soccer team who will find opportunities with local businesses that may not be willing to pay an exorbitant amount of money in exchange for the use of the name, image, and likeness, but maybe a few $1,000s. And that's big for a college athlete.
Absolutely.
So I do believe that there will be quite a bit of opportunity out there. But when we're talking about the huge endorsement deals, that'll be for the select few. And again, in my estimation, that's fine. It's just like in every other industry or for any other college student who may be marketable. I mean, in today's day and age especially, you have these Instagram famous people who might have 1 million or 2 million followers on Instagram and are able to sell posts for a lot of money. And they're in college. If they can do it, why can't athletes?
Absolutely. A lot of people that we've seen on social media and on Reddit, they just like to throw this out, this kind of criticism that's saying, you're ruining college football, or this is going to destroy college football. Take an opportunity here, get on your soapbox, and tell me why this is a worthy fight for you specifically.
Well, look, as I said, there's already competitive imbalance. I mean, look, Alabama's at the top of the football rankings year in, year out. Clemson, Auburn, Florida, etc. I mean, the imbalance is there whether or not we give these athletes the opportunity to make money. And we're not hurting the schools. We're not telling the schools they need to take away money from their coaches or from their facilities and pay players. This has nothing to do with the schools. We're not hurting the NCAA in any way. In fact, the NCAA doesn't even govern postseason play in college football. We're talking really about the NCAA tournament in basketball. And this in no way affects that whatsoever. I've heard recently someone said to me, well, now you're going to have players, let's say in college football, decide that they're going to sit out bowl games. Well, actually, I think it's to the contrary. First of all, you already have some top names sitting out of their bowl games anyway because they're concerned about being injured and they want to be fresh for the NFL. But second of all, you may actually have contracts in place with third parties where they're only going to get paid if they play.
Wow.
Because that's where the value is going to come in for those third parties. So, I mean, yeah, you're always. I remember back when everyone was talking about sports betting and how it would completely change the landscape if the federal government decided to strike the federal prohibition on sports wagering.
Sure.
And look what happened. Last year, it fell. New Jersey has a lot of sports betting. West Virginia, Mississippi, all across the country, you're starting to see more and more. Has it changed sports at all for the worse? I definitely would say no. And I don't think this would either. I think there will certainly be instances where we question the legitimacy, and then I think it'll be up to the states and the schools and the NCAA to enforce their rules and laws.
Yeah. So I want to be respectful of your time, so we'll just one more question, and then we'll let you have a couple of final thoughts. What is the timeline for your guys' legislation? I know you said that the verbiage, you want it to be enacted immediately, but realistically, kind of how long does this fight kind of usually take to work through the Florida Congress?
Well, we're not currently in session. So the bill went to the drafting committee. We have legislation in front of us now. We're perfecting it, and we hope to have it released to the public this Friday. Then it'll be hopefully introduced in session in the beginning of 2020 and put on the governor's desk, signed into law, and maybe it'll be enacted by, let's say, May 2020.
Okay. So we do have a lot of fans in Florida, a lot of viewers in Florida. What's something that they can do to get involved or to help out or voice their opinion one way or the other?
You know, I think once we do provide the language of our legislation, just be as vocal as possible, whether it be on social media or to your own representatives who are in state Congress. Be vocal to the governor as well, because that's very important that we have his support in order to not only pass the legislation, but then sign it into law. You know, and then just to educate yourself as much as possible on these issues and to have a better understanding, because I think that there's a lot of bad information that's being put out there currently about what exactly it is that we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Darren Heitner, one of the lawyers who's crafting legislation for Florida. You can find him on Twitter and keep an eye out once that legislation does hit Congress and get involved if this is important to you. Darren, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darren.
Yep.
So that was Darren Heitner, one of the lawyers crafting legislation in Florida. Ash, I mean, you and I just sat through that interview. I've learned a lot. Definitely see the perspective of where this legislation is headed. What do you think? Do you still are you in support, or do you think it still needs some work?
Number one, definitely needs work, Will. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about it. We need to see the full law and have it put out there, not at 11:59 at night before the close of a vote. It's one of these things where I feel like there's a money grab about to happen. I mean, no disrespect at all toward Darren. He was absolutely cut clear and dry about the entire thing. But I just feel like this is some sort of an opportunity right here for capitalism and fairness. But also we're talking about college athletes receiving state funds most of the time on state scholarship or private school funds through private school scholarship, wherever they may be playing ball at, and the ability to use their name and likeness, which is already kind of celebrated because of how talented some of them are and charismatic or whatever. Another advantage there, and I'm worried that third parties are going to try to latch onto that. Man, if Kyler Murray last year could go out there and do what he did and everything like that and be as charismatic as he was and make lots of money, that's great. But it's that third party that I'm worried about. Who else is getting paid? Is it a typical sports agent, or is there something else going on? Man, there's just so many avenues you could go, and I just know there's mobsters in New Jersey right now lining up outside of Rutgers. I know there is. There's got to be. What do you think, man?
So my concern is kind of with, and this is purely speculative. It has nothing to do with the conversation we had in with Darren or with anything that may or may not be going on. I have absolutely no basis of fact to put this on, but we've heard for years and years and years this idea of bagmen who are silently paying players under the table. My concern is now what happens if you are a car dealership owner and I'm a booster. If I go to you and I hand you $10,000 to give to a player. Are we kind of just basically making it legal and how I just don't see that as a scenario that's too far-fetched. And so I have to wonder and just really question the morality and the efficacy of it, while also respecting the capitalism of it. If there are people out there who want to pay Will Ranier to come and endorse their product, um, you know, I have to seriously consider that. And just because I'm a college athlete or, doing what I'm doing now in my current profession, should I be allowed to do that? And I think that there's overwhelmingly a lot of people that will say, yes, a person should be able to do that. So I see it both ways.
Yeah.
Maybe if anything, this just kind of helps rein it all in and just gives it a legal avenue for things that are already happening. And so it's hard for me to really take a hard line against this legislation. I think it will generally be a good thing, but like anything else, I think it'll be abused and people will find loopholes. But I think that those will be the exception as opposed to the rule.
Yeah, man. It's just that it feels like what they're trying to do in the states that have already put the law out there and everything is take that next step. This won't be the final iteration. This won't
No
be
way.
how it finally ends up. We're heading toward a place where all NCAA athletes, and right now it's going to be predominantly young males, men's college basketball and college football. That's who's going to be the big draw. And we're heading toward a place where all NCAA athletes are effectively on a payroll, not a stipend, not a little handout, not a scholarship. And I know that's been the argument for many years that these guys are receiving a scholarship, they're receiving a free education. Fantastic. Sure. Most of us don't receive a free education. Okay, we don't get that. I didn't get one, but beside that fact, there's just too many ways that this is heading toward a place where we're just going to have to pay everybody. Sure. That's what it is. I can't get any offensive lineman to sign with me because our quarterback is the center star of the attraction. Is that a draw to the NFL? Do the guys say, well, I'll get to play next to Kyler Murray and he'll ride me all the way to the NFL? Man, there's no guarantee to that,
Sure.
So how does the kid that was going to go to Oklahoma, who is from Stillwater, how does he, change his mind and say, you know what, man, I don't know that's a guarantee. I'm going to go to OK State instead.
Sure.
It's going to be tough.
Yeah, and to Darren's point, I think that is happening in other areas as we are now. That people are applying intrinsic value to universities in different ways by whatever's important to them, and so I think Darren has a great point that these things are already happening in some shape or form. But now when you introduce money into it, it kind of gets muddy. I do think that obviously this will be income, so it will be taxable, so we should be able to track it. I think that we should know. Or maybe we shouldn't know. I mean, this is another debate. Should we know how much a player has gotten paid for their name, image, and likeness? Does it matter? Do you care? Do I care? Maybe I don't. But maybe there's some people out there that just want to know for transparency. I don't know if there's really a legal grounds that someone could force somebody to, make their income public. But that's another layer to all of this. That's going to be part of the discussion as we move forward.
It is an overriding. You said something about intrinsic value. Facilities are great. The fan base is great. It's close to my home. But, oh, crap, Eugene, Oregon's offering me all this stuff and compensation. And if I'm on the payroll, they're likely I'm going to also be on the inside with Nike. They're going to consider me. Will I have a job down the road when I leave there in Pro Sports Falls? This is stuff California. In their rush to put this law out there. And I understand they've taken some time to put this together, but I feel like why this law? Why now? Who's in it for the money grab right now? There is something under the surface, dude. something under the surface.
Yeah. Darren had a great point, that this shouldn't affect recruiting because, now you're talking about someone who's a non-college athlete, that what they're looking at doing would apply directly to college athletes. But, if you want to tell me that recruits aren't going to talk to the guys on their visits and ask these questions, you pretty well know that this is going to be a topic of conversations when players do their visits and the guys are going to talk to each other.
This means more at the end of the day than almost anything. I can see a school with the crappiest facilities, a 60-year-old weight bench, being able to have the right money men involved to offer all these guys cash and them getting the recruits. And while I sound a little spoiled as an Alabama alumni sitting here with our facilities saying that's all we could do legally. Yeah. That's all we could do is offer them facilities and winning tradition, opportunity for rings and all that stuff legally. Do I think that's all that's been going on? My head would have to be firmly up my ass if I said that. If I said that, I think that's all that's going
Absolutely.
on. But I also think it's going on at UT Austin. I think it's going on at UT Knoxville. I think it's going on at UNC Chapel Hill to a lesser extent. It's too gray, man. It's just too gray right now.
There's a lot of gray, and this isn't going to be the last we're going to hear. It's not going to be the last we're going to talk about it. Like I said in the onset, 12 different states have legislation in some form of development. And so, I think it's just a matter of time before we see some kind of cosmic shift, at least in the name, image, and likeness realm for college sports. So this isn't the last we're going to hear about it. But I think this is something that is very important. It is a little bit outside of what we usually talk about on the show, but I think that there's definitely a place for us to follow this story here.
Great stuff, man. It really is. Glad you hooked up with Darren. The guy's really sharp.
Absolutely, yeah.